All right. Good, very warm and good afternoon, everyone. And I welcome you to today's session. I'm Shreya Majumdar, and I work with the Center for Responsible Business. I am a program manager with them as part of their business and human rights vertical. Today's session has been brought to you in partnership with the Indo-German Chamber of Commerce, Friedrich Naumann Foundation for South Asia, and the Federation of Indian Micro and Small and Medium Enterprises, also known as FISME. Before we move forward, I would like to give you a little bit of an introduction about what the Center for Responsible Business is and what it is that we do. So we are an action-oriented policy think tank working with a vision to mainstream responsible business conduct by working with a variety of stakeholders on evidence-based policy advocacy, capacity building, awareness generation, and implementing multi-stakeholder initiatives. We support actors and stakeholders across the value chain. These could be national and transnational buyers or brands, local manufacturers and suppliers, national and international organizations, civil society organizations, and of course, governments, as they move towards a more sustainable and responsible future. CRB has also in the past worked with the Government of India Ministry of Corporate Affairs on the zero draft of the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights, which we hope will, the final version of which we hope will come out real soon. We work across 5 key areas: circular economy, private sector and SDGs, voluntary sustainable standards, SMEs and sustainability, and of course, business and human rights. And today's session has been brought to you as part of the work that we do within the business and human rights vertical at CRB. As part of our engagement with the BHR agenda, this year we decided to curate a 3-part webinar series specifically for the SME sector and to bring the dialogue of responsible business or sustainability or business and human rights, however you may want to call it, so to them, to their table, and to sort of unpack in practical terms what it means for an SME to conduct their business responsibly and hope to sort of inspire them with some good practice examples and approaches, and what are the kind of expectations that big businesses have of them in view of the legislations, the NGRBC and the impending NAP that's around. So as part of this 3-part webinar series, the first session sort of focused on introducing and simplifying the topic of business and human rights, its relevance and growing importance for and expectations from SMEs in contributing towards this agenda. The second webinar, we attempted to equip them with some practical advice, with some industry leaders coming in and sort of sharing their insights and perspectives on how an SME can move towards adopting the BHR agenda into their daily operation. Today, we are at the third and the final series of this webinar, and as part of this, we will hopefully look at and attempt to highlight certain best practices and examples of businesses that have adopted the agenda within their supply chain, and how SMEs need to engage with business responsibility, and what are the areas of capacity building or training or networking that SMEs may probably could look at to sort of adopt a more hands-on approach to business and human rights. So without further delay, I'm to sort of spearhead today's conversation. I have with me some esteemed practitioners and thought leaders. I will sort of introduce them as we go along in today's conversation. My first panelist tonight that I would like to welcome is Mr. Ranjit Sarma. He's Head of Compliance, Corporate Social Responsibility, Plan A, India and Sri Lanka region, Marks and Spencer's India Private Limited. He has also previously been a CSR points person with specialty retail brands, both European and American, dealing with apparel and a monitoring and evaluation resource with a multi-brand supermarket store with products ranging from soft lines and hard lines in specialties. He also possesses a significant amount of experience and exposure in stakeholder engagement at a brand level, social environmental auditing, training and capacity building programs, and of course, research and project management. Mr. Sarma, I welcome you to today's session and thank you so much. for taking out the time from your schedule and working, sort of joining us in today's panel. Over to you now.
Thank you, Shreya, and really happy to be part of this learning session and learning and sharing session. What I'll do is, I would like to bring in the perspective of my individual journey, across different sectors. Uh, but before that, it would be also pertinent to actually bring in the company for which I work for, the approach we take as a company towards human rights. So if it's all right, should I start, or you would like to
No, please go ahead. Please.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, so I'm just sharing my screen now. Okay, can you see my screen? Fantastic. So, I think as a company, we are a British multinational, I think established in 1883, 84. And throughout, I think there has been a lot of learnings. And it is but obvious that, as a company, with footprints across countries, including stores as well as, supply chain, it is imperative that issue which is so important as human rights should be part of the discourse and our approach. So our backbone as a company, like when you talk about the human rights, our global sourcing principles. Now, because a little bit about what I do is I am actually part of the supply chain, and which also ensures that my focus is more about ensuring supply chain risk mitigation, and also looking at the human rights aspects across different tiers of the supply chain. So although we have a very well thought out approach and policy, most brands have, most organizations have. So it will be also pertinent to actually discuss here about what is our approach on. So if you look at from a sourcing perspective, and as a company, and then and then I'm actually talking on behalf of different companies, different retailers who are in this area. There are a lot of risks associated. Whether you're talking about clothing and home, you're talking about food, you're talking about commerce. So what happens is, there are international stakeholders, and that's why as a business, wherever you have your footprint, it's important to not only ensure that your supply chain is protected. You have to also look at from a perspective of the security of the supply. That's actually purely a business perspective. But beyond that, also as an organization, it's also important that you continuously engage with the different stakeholders. And I think for us, the most important stakeholders are the workers who are actually working in our supply chain. And if you look at the headlines, from ethical imperative, you would see there has been different news, all over, where it does refer you know to the different issues there which come in across time. So what we do, what is our approach? I think the first step is essentially, as a company, it's very important that we should not look at human rights in isolation. It is always important that we embed human rights, which means charity begins with promoting human rights in our business. Next step is obviously promoting human rights in our supply chain, engaging with rights holders and other stakeholders, communicating how our human rights impacts our interests. So this is what I think any organization which is seeking to look at addressing the human rights issue, whether within their company or within their extended supply chain should look at. Uh, Apart from that, obviously, I'll come to each of these in a bit. Apart from that, it's important to actually look at the whole aspect of capacity building. So how do we do that? I think, as we say, when we are saying that promoting human rights in our supply chain, uh, just by preaching, it's not going to work. So as a responsible company, it's important that you also do a lot of training and engagement with them. I can actually I'll share a few examples in the coming slides. And at the same time, I think it's also important to look at the monitoring aspect also. So because and it's very very clear, we have a very robust global sourcing principle, wherein we agree with our prospective partners that the like we are doing due diligence in our immediate supply chain. It is also imperative upon them to look at their supply chain. So that's why we have looking at systems pertaining to grievance handling channels and mechanisms, which is within MNS, the company, and also which are non-Marks and Spencer grievance mechanisms. So that's the approach. So which means monitoring and capacity building. This is a very important part when we are actually looking at promoting human rights within our supply chain. Then third is of course understanding the potential human rights impacts of our activities in business relationships. So obviously when we are sourcing from a country, now that's today we stay in a global village, as I already shared that we have footprints, whether in the form of stores or whether in the form of sourcing activities across supply chain. So it's very important to also understand that what could be the potential impacts of our activities. So which means identification of human rights risks and salient issues, land rights, the rights of the smallholders. I mean, for example, let's say when we talk about raw materials. So I mean, cotton is, for example, if I'm saying from a clothing and home perspective, raw materials. I think 90% of our farmers are smallholders. So how do you ensure the rights of the smallholders? What principles do you look at? So you have to have the right collaboration to actually ensure the rights of the smallholders. Similarly, we talk about the land rights, and then of course a very important issue about right to water. Then last but not the least is also you cannot change the world alone, because when you talk about a supply chain, it is a shared supply base out there, and you as a individual company cannot make that change alone, because neither you one might have the resources, neither have the the scope of engaging and then helping the extended supply chain. So that's why it's important to actually identify and look at partnership and driving convergence in the supply chain practices. And then last but not the least, of course, is the public policy and advocacy. So as part of the business and human rights policy and our strategy and approach, we do engage with different like-minded stakeholders across the horizon, and we see changes that happen. So I mean, a little example I wanted to give about understanding of the potential human rights impact. I think what we do is any country we work in. So what we did, we actually partnered with an international agency, which actually helped us with a risk mapping. So being a UK company, and then since we have some of the salient issues which we wanted to look at a human rights angle, living wages, we have water, discrimination, forced labor, health and safety, secure work, customer security, freedom of association, and likewise land rights, child labor, working hours. So what we did was we actually asked, the people across and ask them, that agency to actually map the risks, which we might have in the supply chain. That actually went back, in a big way to help us formulate our strategy across different countries. Because one thing is very clear that one size fits all does not apply when we are looking at an operation of that scale. And what makes a big difference is you need to also have internal guiding principle, which is actually for Marks and Spencer is so of course Plan A started way back the early 2000s, and we actually came up with a revamped version in where we put our focus in three main pillars. One was about creating awareness, which means transforming individuals and communities. Second was nourishing livelihoods, and third is obviously caring for the planet. Of course, the first one which talked about nourishing livelihoods, and so it essentially were to look at our customers, specifically our food customers. They get the right food product in terms of their nourishment. And then we talk about transformation of communities, which essentially looked at individuals and communities which are in and around our stores and sourcing bases. So how could we actually leverage goodwill and also work with them to make that change? And obviously caring for our planet is essentially again pertains to the changes in environment, what impact we can actually make from our environmental perspective. So in fact, across three pillars, we made around 100 commitments. I can give you some examples, for example, if you talk about caring for our planet, we actually made a commitment that by 2019, all our raw materials will come from sustainable sources. So today, if you are wearing or eating Marks and Spencer food, you could be rest assured that either the clothing, the cotton that's coming in is either fair trade or better cotton initiative, or the food which you are bringing in, eating from Marks and Spencer's supply chain, it's again fair trade. And similarly, if you give an example of the transforming communities, one example would be looking at gender equality, for example. So we have made a commitment that by 2025, 25% of our supply chains would have 25% of the women in managerial levels. So in India, for example, we are driving gender equality at a very, very large scale. And we had some which is called Project Power, which was in partnership with UK government. And also recently we also signed an MOU with Apparel Exports Promotion Council to actually make it a industry-wide phenomenon. So as I was speaking that why collaboration is so important. We can't change the world alone. So these are some of the organizations with whom we have collaborated to drive change. TEDx, capacity building projects. We have we have collaborated with DSR. Similarly, we are also members of Sustainable Apparel Coalition, Foreign and Commonwealth Office, as I gave an example, where we partnered with them to drive the gender equality project in India. Oxfam, most of you, those of you who have actually visited our international stores in UK, you see we have this collaboration related to swapping. So it's actually looking at circularity, where used clothes are actually donated to Oxfam, which are refurbished and again resold. In fact, 2 years ago, we also invited Oxfam to, you know, to get a sneak peek to our leather supply chain in India. And just to make a fair assessment about the issues which we have. In fact, based on the recommendation, in fact, we are embarking upon a huge program on worker engagement, capturing worker voice. So it's important, because at times it's important to have critical partners standing by us, so that we know exactly what we are doing right, what we are doing not quite right, and what can we actually do better. Obviously, these are our key learnings. So it does take a long time. Only just getting to starting. Human rights is a complicated issue, and different stakeholders are engaged, and a lot of these solutions are actually not within the area of control of. That's why it's important and the policy and advocacy piece. Similarly, it's important to build a burning platform to act to gain momentum. I think collaboration is the key to go way forward. Also important that if we want to make human rights relatable, how do we ensure that it is understood by the different parts of the business. So it should not be the baby of maybe one department of the company. Similarly, establishing right governance, so we can build business wide engagement, but small enough to gain traction. Invest in cross business practitioners, and obviously there's a lot of learning. That's why again, bring back the whole discussion related to stakeholders, collaborating with them, and sharing more. You know, because even if you have negative impacts, so it's important that if you share more, you learn from others. Then we have some practical tools and guidance. Because, I wanted to bring upon how we look at the approach of the last mile of the business is kind of touched. So what we did was we actually came up. We were one of the first companies here from the retail side, an international UK company to hold conference. We have held two of them. One was in India, I think, in 2016, and the next one was done in Turkey. So there we actually released the forced labor toolkit, which actually gives you an interesting insight about how to go about identifying issues related to forced labor. And of course, this is requirement. You must be aware that we have the modern day slavery law, which makes it mandatory for companies certain turnover to compulsorily report forced labor or like modern day slavery within their supply chain, right down up to the cotton, right up to the raw materials. So it's important that how do you cascade it to the supply chain and operations. So it's important that that we as a company, we need to take a business commitment to tackle forced labor, policy and process to manage forced labor, conduct risk assessment to identify areas of forced labor, only work with legitimate labor providers, that's very, very important, promote social dialogue with management, workers and trade unions, ensure freedom of movement, access to documents and ability to leave workplace, establish grievance mechanism that all workers can access, and develop a process for remedying any cases of forced labor. So that's the whole approach, which actually is there in the toolkit, which we have actually shared with all our suppliers, so that there is a parallel cascading effect among all the suppliers. Then obviously, what is a good practice to mitigate this? So I think one example example of a clear and present risk which we had. This was actually a study done by one of the national organizations. First time, they were the ones who had actually quantified, and the results were really scary in a way. So, if you look at this slide here, that 45 million people are employed in our textiles and clothing sectors. 60% are women. Then 1 in 14 women, garment workers, according to the report, had experienced physical violence. 1 in 7 garment workers has been raped or forced to commit a sexual act. 3.6% of reported cases of violence resulted in action by factory or police. However, zero criminal charges were brought against perpetrators. So again, these are of course, indicative of the different service that was done. So we acted. In fact, based on that report and also our commitment, we actually ended up running a program on gender equality. So program was completed in 3 phases. The focus of the program was more on equality. Equality was essentially looking at not only just putting all the burden of change on women, but also on men. So engaging men was a very important focus of that program. It was more about the awareness about difference between biology and what is gender. I think there is a lot of I think what misconceptions and also confusions which really reign high in terms of stereotypes. So it is essentially more of a behavioral change that was actually needed. The second thing was obviously because our supply chain has institutions in the form of manufacturing sites. We are as an institution, even if we are staying in a gender unequal society, it is the duty of the institutions to uphold the sanctity of the gender equality. And here we also took as the POSH Act 2013 as the baseline, and then also the regulatory reference to actually implement the accountability part, which also helped us actually strengthening the ICCs in the factories. And then again, another aspect of the behavioral changes that was needed, because the responsiveness part, because great accountability and awareness does not at times give you the right output in terms of a redressal. So it was very important to also maybe train and engage with different stakeholders, so that they could actually respond positively to the demands to promote gender equality. So this is what I have in terms of the presentation, and share my screen now. But in a nutshell, I think it's very important that as a company, uh, you have to look at defining your approach, which should be in sync with your human rights policy, human rights and business policy. And then case studies needs to be generated, which could be then again maybe replicated, uptaken and scaled up, and adopted, and then more and more stakeholders can be part of the discourse. So that would be what my viewpoint would be at this moment of time. Thank you so much.
Great. No, thank you, Mr. Sarma. I think that was extremely insightful, and I'm personally very happy to know that gender is a focus for Marks and Spencer's in the coming years. No, I'm sure, and I'm sure everyone's benefited from whatever you sort of shared with us. I would also urge our participants to sort of shoot their questions in the chat box. If you have any for Mr. Sarma and of course the other panelists, you can put them down in the chat box and we'll get it to the speakers. I'd now like to invite Mr. Indras Ghosh. He's the Sustainability Manager and Acting Head of Sustainability Projects, Indo-German Chamber of Commerce. He specializes in business strategy and sustainability projects with a special focus on international business operations and bilateral trade and cooperation. Mr. Ghosh, thank you so much for joining us today, and I now welcome you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ms. Majumdar. Very good afternoon to participants. It's a pleasure to be here amongst great experts, Mr. Rajiv Sharma. Thank you very much, and I congratulate you on your best practice, your excellent best practice, and it's also quite difficult to follow up from that act. Also, would like to welcome Dr. Suman Majumdar. It's a pleasure to be here with you, and Mr. Anil Bhartwaj as well. Hopefully in the next 10-15 minutes I'll be able to give some answers. It is not enough time for the topic so complex, but most importantly also raise some more questions from all of you today, because I think through discussions and exchange is how exactly we develop this into a more effective tool for inclusive growth. And so I hope you can see my screen. Yes? Okay. All right. So I would like to start by saying that, it is important to remember that business and human rights essentially was born as a demand from consumers. Many people believe this is originated by the government, who put laws to keep businesses in check. Yeah. Well, if you look at the development, the consumers were the one who demand greater responsibility by businesses, which in turn make government to come up with due diligence laws for companies. In this case, in the examples that I've chosen, these are intended for large companies based on number of employees in Germany, for example. And like Mr. Sharma already said, in the UK, it's based on a certain amount of turnover. However, the intended recipient of that law, although large companies, however, there is an effect where the sharing of the due diligence responsibility will eventually be shared within large companies and SMEs. And this is something that I would like to highlight, because most of the time, a lot of companies say, well, we don't fall under that law, so we don't have to worry about business and human rights law. While in reality, they are also an active stakeholder in this. It is also important for the points that I will discuss to highlight that there are essentially two broad categories of human rights compliance. Yeah. One is based on reporting, and the other one is supply chain due diligence based on identification, assessment, and remediation. On the left side, it's the adequate human rights due diligence stops at the point where you have identified, assess, and report. Give the example here in the US Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act, companies only need to prove in their report that goods imported into the US were not produced using child labor, for example. Another example of this is in the UK Modern Slavery Act. Before it is amended in 2015, there was no provision to prevent child labor and sexual harassment, for example. So it is completely your obligation as a company stops when you've identified and report the human rights violation. The second one is based on the same thing. However, companies are obliged to provide remediation, prevention, monitoring, and reporting. The example of this would be the French corporate due vigilance law, as well as the upcoming German Supply Chain Act. Both of us share very similar approach. However, the French one takes a little more toward the child labor, as well. The German supply chain has to do with social and, to a certain extent, the environmental impact of companies' activities. Since business and human rights is driven by consumers, as we have shown in the previous slide. It's also remember that this is something which companies need to take up as a business opportunity. Yes, there are compliance, and therefore this is an opportunity for them to build, grow longer term, a more resilient business, and build long-lasting relations between the stakeholders as well. Next slide would be, these are the different points, or rather factors, which contribute to the complexity of business and human rights implementation. For example, here, the duality approach that we have discussed in the previous slide, as well as the modern complexity of supply chains, essentially lead to factors such as, different and overlapping regulation, which leads to, additional burdens on reporting, for example. Cross-border enforcement can also be a problem. For example, companies who are overseeing the implementation sitting in Germany, they may have a problem enforcing it to their suppliers in India. The number of suppliers and sub-suppliers generally, as it increases, the more complex the process becomes. And of course, there is a difficulty in visibly map the supply chains. I'll demonstrate that in a little bit. And some laws also has this provision where you should perform adequate due diligence. Of course, then where does that start and where does that end? So many a time there's also unclear regulations in this law as well. The last one will be the unique challenges on the different economic sector itself, and this is why, like my previous speaker said, it is difficult for us to say to come up with a solution where one solution fits all. All these challenges contribute to the fact that it is unique for every company, and therefore we cannot formulate one which will be suitable for all companies across the board, right? Here, I would like to show where there's a relationship between companies who are affected by the law, as well as the suppliers and sub-suppliers. Take the example here, using a simplified version of the supply chains. Modern supply chain is very much more complex than this. Essentially here, the affected company on the right side has, for example, 4 tiers of supply chain, 3PLs, part manufacturers, processing and refinery, and raw material extraction. Within the suppliers may or may not have sub-suppliers of their own. Essentially here, within the existing supply chain that I have mapped here in the upstream, there is already a lot of suppliers and sub-suppliers, and we haven't even taken account the downstream supply chain yet. So from the point of view of the company who are affected by the law, this is how it looks like. The visibility as you move further toward the upstream essentially decreases, and because of this, also the compliance burden sharing process becomes longer, and this will likely mean there's a progressively greater burden to identify, assess, and report human rights violation. Think of it as you having guests over to your house. If that guest is your friend, you will of course tell them to come in straight away because you know them, you're good friends with them, so no problem. But if that person is stranger, then you will ask a lot of questions to ensure that he or she is safe to come into your house. So the same thing here apply here. So, and this lack of visibility is known to the assembling company. However, the suppliers in the supply chain may not necessarily know that this is the case. So there is already a different point of view here where the affected company doesn't have visibility, and therefore put more conditions and requirement to the suppliers, but the suppliers themselves may think of it as unnecessarily a high burden for them to do from the company. So where does that leave us for SMEs? Again, this is something which does not fit all. This is something which companies can look at if they want to start their own business in human rights mechanism. We did some short analysis a while back on what would be the impact on SMEs in India in regards to the German due diligence law. The first one would be an increase in business inflow to SMEs in India. India enjoy a very high reputation as a trusted trade partner who respect business and human rights as well. Yeah, not saying there are no problem. However, we remain the top trade partner across the globe, and this reputation increases by the day. So with this, we see that there is a more inflow of business to SMEs in India. Having said that, there is likely to be this business and human rights responsibility sharing likely to be a part of SME's contractual agreement with buyers, which means it is a milestone that they need to accomplish as part of their agreement. And the third would be there will be an on-site inspections on social environmental audits against international standards. This will increase as the impact. And the fourth one would be setting up a complaint mechanism and communicating to their own workers, which Mark and Spencer have shown us greatly how it can be done. And so, if you're an SME, how do you prepare yourself moving forward? You have your own challenges and your limitations, and I want to say first of all that you do not start from scratch. There are organizations and institutions that can help you out to reach an objective. But the first thing that you need to do is a lot of companies do not understand yet what is their level of exposure to the business and human rights regulation, as well as their vulnerability to business human rights violations. So the first one you need to do is you need to understand what is the level of due diligence in your buyer's country. Also, what is the level of due diligence you required in your own country, and try to understand them in parallel, because there will be overlapping which you can use to your advantage moving forward. Secondly, you need to understand the relevant environmental and social requirements that you need to do. You don't need to answer to all of them. Many countries, including India, have a set of requirements that you need to do. You need to understand that as well. The second thing that you need to do is you need to measure how vulnerable you are, your own operations, to human rights violations. This can be done by first understanding what is the extent of your obligations. Some regulations, such as the one in Germany, require you to take care of social and environmental impacts of your operations, while others are very specific to, say, child labor. So understanding these obligations can be quite important. The second one would be to perform human rights impact assessments. Essentially, what does your operations do in terms of human rights violations in your supply chain? And the third one would be, after you understand what kind of risks you are exposed to, you need to prioritize them. Again, you do not need to address all of human rights risks. There are requirements, and you need to prioritize them according to your relevant region or relevant industry, etc. And at the bottom here, I've listed certain stakeholders that can help you along the way. In terms of exposure, for example, it can usually be done through your internal processes, but also there are not-for-profit organizations who can help you along in ascertaining your current position. NGOs, NFP, and even social society who are aware of what are the legal obligations where you are located can help you in these steps. The second one would be to streamline structure and process. Many of these business and human rights commitment require you to have human rights statement. That's a good start. That's a good point to start. Regulations such as the UK's Anti-Slavery Act require you to have different statement for each financial year. And of course, the steps that you will take to prevent it for each financial year. So you need to understand what is it that you need. Do you need a statement which will be there for the rest of your business organization, or you need to do it financially? Clear policies to obtain human rights information and supply chains. Usually, if you are connected to large organizations, these are already established. So I would suggest if you're an SME, you speak to your buyers and ask them, is there already a guideline, a policy that you can share with us so that we can also perform this for you and we can share that burden of human rights due diligence. And the third one will be systematic steps to ensure human rights violations are addressed. Many of time, this is not done just because companies do not prioritize the human rights risk. So in the previous step, you prioritize your human rights risk, and then you go through systematic approach to address them as well. For example, through checklists, a toolkit, these are simple, practical tools that you can employ as well. The next one will be the performance and resources. Many a time I see that a lot of small companies have their own set of checklists, document, and processes, and of course, then to have to combine all of this together would be very time consuming. So again, speak to your buyers and sellers and come up with a checklist, documents, formats, process flow, which all of you can use, and then of course extract data and information quickly so that there is no duplication of work as you perform human rights due diligence. The second one is quite important. My previous speaker here also spoke about resource sharing, financial support to the SMEs. This is again important for SMEs. It is often the resources are quite limited. Yeah, so one way to share resources and talent would be to integrate human rights measures against performance indicator. For example, giving a certain percentage of bonus, you can say, once that company pass the human rights due diligence audit. So it has to make sense from the SMEs to perform this this process of human rights due diligence. And the last part would be the clear expectations to the cost sharing, which is related to the second one in the implementation of human rights due diligence. We always say that here you need to speak to your buyers and to understand what is it that they expect you to perform. Yeah, but at the same time, then there need to be a collaborative approach in terms of cost sharing on the implementation of that set process. So this is again very important. So to ensure that there is a sustainable business model here on the implementation itself. Again, on the bottom here, you are not alone. Your buyers and your sellers and your NGOs can support you in all this implementation. Get in touch with them, collaborate with them instead of doing it all your own. Third one that I would like to bring up is that there is already existing platforms that you can use for free. The first one will be locally enforced human rights due diligence. We find that the best way to ensure that your suppliers and sub-suppliers are on board is, of course, to talk to them, collaborate with them, and work together. However, you also, depending on which law you follow, need somebody who can perform on-site assessment, negotiation, and mediation. So we suggest you to work with your local experts who know the ground, what's happening on the ground, and of course ask them to work with your suppliers. So this can be a local government, can be a state government, it can be a civil society or industry associations. Who you can approach if you're someone who are sitting in Germany, for example, to collaborate with your suppliers for the enforcement and the assessment of business and human rights law. And last would be skilling and accreditation. Business and human rights itself is a continuously progressing, improving topic. So it is important for everyone to train on the topic and understand what is the current status of the law, what is the current trend. So again, industry associations, including IGCC, actually offer training to help companies map their supply chain, for example, work with workers' engagement so that they understood what is needed to do in every steps of human rights due diligence. Oftentimes, there are organizations, reputable ones, who give accreditations on business and human rights. So if you can have access to that, then you can already have like a stamp of approval that you don't need a lot of regulations and report to prove that you are compliant. Yeah, and most importantly, to bridge the gap with between what the companies are doing and also to the suppliers and sub suppliers, to make sure that we are working in the same direction. Regular workshops and participation and continuous engagements is very important here. So you need to also have this probably at least twice a year to make sure that everyone understand what is required. So probably this is a concept. So looking at the different stakeholders here, I would call them business and human rights mix. So the intensity where you, or the frequency where you engage with them, where you engage with them, and utilization of each strand of the stakeholders relevant to your organizations would contribute to the success or failure of your business and human rights. And all these questions will require, not every organization in every sector will have the same human rights mix, and understanding where your partners, trusted partners, can be utilized and collaborated on will go a long way to design and implement a human rights due diligence mechanism. That's it from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ghosh. I think that was like a walking toolkit for the SMEs to sort of go about the business and human rights agenda and how to adopt them. I think self-explanatory and very insightful. Yeah, so moving on, I would now like to invite Dr. Suman Majumdar. He's a sustainability policy and strategy expert. He's a senior leader designing and implementing sustainability strategies and integrated thinking practices to build capacity in corporate and non-profit organizations. He cultivates business partnerships, engages internal, external stakeholders, and collaborates cross-functionally to raise awareness and execute process improvements in corporate sustainability, environmental management, and climate change. He's proficient in areas of transparency and disclosure and has also served as the Chief Sustainability Officer for the JSW Group. Dr. Majumdar, thank you so much. He's joining us from Singapore, everyone. So yeah, thank you so much for joining in, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Shreya and IGCC and CRB for having me here. It's a great pleasure to be part of this group and be part of this audience. I say audience because listening to the other speakers and the overall session itself is a learning experience of sorts. So one never has a problem learning from the other presenters. So So with about 30 years of experience in the fields of sustainability, ESG, that includes things like the human rights and the businesses. Uh, what I will be talking about here will be more of experiences, real life case studies, or different examples to drive home a point. I'm fortunate that the previous two presenters, presenters I say because they were actually showing some things on the screen, whereas I will be just talking. So they have laid the foundation, and I will be not repeating what they have said, but instead let me do a quick overview of the size of the challenge that we have when we are saying human rights, talking about SMEs, we are talking about the growing economy, we're trying to talk of inclusive growth. So these elements can be possible only when we can learn from each other. At a higher level, when you look at South Asia and you also look at Southeast Asia, where I'm currently located, we have a good body which looks at these topics with great interest. And that's, there are two bodies. One is at the international level, which is the Asian Development Bank. And at the national level, of course, you've got the Government of India. So putting some statistics and numbers that they have recently put up in the last 3 to 4 months, I did that search and I came up with some of those interesting numbers. The latest figures for India talks about 11.5 to 12 crores of people come under the MSME. Now, I am deviating slightly from the scope of the title mentioned here on the screen, which talks about SMEs. I am adding the M before it. So the micro enterprises also, I'm clubbing them under this bracket. So when one looks at MSMEs, there are about those 11.5 to 12 crores of workers. So that many persons in India alone. And if you add up, numbers from the other countries in the region, it will definitely be far higher. And since South Asia, Southeast Asia make up almost a quarter of the world's population, you can imagine, when you talk of fractions, how big and significant that number is. That's the context. And in terms of number of enterprises, we have almost 6.5 crores of MSME enterprises, and that's as recent as end of October. So a couple of months ago, statistics as mentioned by the Government of India. So we are looking at that kind of numbers of people, and these MSMEs, they contribute to almost 30% of the GDP, which is true for South Asia, which is true for Southeast Asia, and which is true for India, of course, as a country specifically. So it's roughly been that 30% plus for the last 4 or 5 years. And let's not get into more of those numbers. But from an investor point of view, there is also a thing called the Bombay Stock Exchange. It has created an SME platform which expects more than 60 SMEs to be entering the markets in this financial year. So, despite the pandemic, despite all the clawbacks and the drawdowns, it is still a significant number, I would say, when so many of the MSMEs are bold enough, are confident enough, and are strong enough to make it to a listing. And the moment they get into that, many other conditions become binding on them. So that is what one needs to keep in mind. And the other interesting fact is we always hear that there is a cash crunch, there is a resource crunch in MSMEs. But then what Government of India has found out is these MSMEs are very rapidly adopting digital payments and online payments. So much so that 72% of the payments in the current fiscal, I mean the 12-month period, so it is almost like the calendar year really, it has been online or digital, and about 28% so less than 30% by cash. So this is also probably induced by the pandemic, but whatever it is, they are taking to adopting technology, and the new generation of companies coming under, registered and joining are probably having an advantage that they are having access or they are familiar with some of these basic technologies. So that's one very good aspect to keep. Coming to the question of human rights, now this has been something which is very vast. And before I get into more specific examples from corporate India and some other companies, I would also like to say that in October this year, again coincidentally, the UN Human Rights Council recognized a new kind of a human right, apart from all the human rights one may be familiar with. They said having a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is definitely a human right. So one shouldn't have to ask for it. It is a right. That means the government is obliged to provide those services and facilities and enabling environment which can help to create that. So this is something which will be of interest, and many of the corporates who are also tying up promoting human rights along their own initiatives need to be informed and advised about that. It's not just doing something for their own business, not just responsible sourcing initiatives, not just CSR initiatives. It can be tied in and made even more powerful. So what happens as a result is it leads to even fulfilling many of the sustainable development goals, which also the UN keeps talking about. And the government of India also brings out every year. Niti Aayog does that. They bring out a progress report, a voluntary national review update, which is submitted to the UN. And you have each goal, UN Sustainable Development Goal, mapped to one or the other central ministry, and the states are ranked and assessed on all of those goal related targets and parameters and performance. So these details you can get on the Niti Aayog site. And this is also what companies and businesses need to take note of, and they can tie in whichever state or states they are operating in. It becomes a very useful tool to promote the human rights part of it, because that definitely figures in more than one of those SDGs that we are talking about. The other area where the financial markets and the cash flows and the investors are pushing for promoting human rights is through the investor assessment and the credit rating agencies, how they rate businesses. So this is where I will take advantage of my work before I moved to Singapore in the JSW group, where I was engaging with many of the FIIs, the foreign institutional investors and the other rating agencies, not only in India but also the international ones, where apart from the usual climate change, GHG, environment, water footprint related queries, there was also a significant amount relating to the social, the community, and the human rights and the supply chain related issues. So this is where we also have been responding from there. And in fact, I got it started, almost 7-8 years ago when I was just into that role. And let me now give you some more examples of where the human rights figure so prominently in the markets, and the markets drive promoting better performance on the human rights. One significant development has been, it's not so new now, it's from 1997 really. We've had the Social Accountability 8000 management system, which looks largely at the rights of the workers. And many of the workers in many of the big companies are also provided by the vendors of the service providers. They provide the human capital, whether it's a temporary job or it is some assignment or any project. So the workers are all from that, and not everybody is on the permanent payrolls of the businesses. So when one does either the SA 8000 certification for the workers in the site, whether they are permanent or temporary, and also in the supply chain. So which means the moment you talk about a supply chain to a large company, you are going into the MSME. As you go further, the primary supplier, secondary supplier, tertiary supplier, you're getting into those elements. And SA 8000 is typically taken by two kinds of organizations. One, which is a market driven, which means the customer wants it, and that is typically the export oriented units, the textiles and the those kind of things that we've had traditionally in India, the Tirupurs, the Ludhianas, the Jalandhars. They are the kinds of locations where we've got the maximum number of certifications, where they look at the human rights element as well. And the second kind is the large companies who are very conscious of how they come across, and when they want to compete in the global level, they've got to compete with the biggies. And for that, they have to demonstrate to the world, despite being in the emerging economy, they are no less, or they are at least trying very hard, and they are committed to match that kind of a performance level. So that becomes another very interesting and positive note. And for those of you who are probably not so aware of the SA 8000, it really stems from hinges on three main pillars. One is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Second is all about the ILO conventions. And third is the national laws prevailing on the human rights and the good work practices as far as the people are concerned, especially the rights of the workers, which is they're the ones who are probably the least heard, or they have the least voice, or they are not talked about in public very frequently. So to give them an equal opportunity or a chance to be visible and have that quality of life, that is where it was set up. Let me quickly shift now to a whole bunch of examples from my days at JSW, and I think I will stop with that and then leave it for the next part of the session today. Now, when we talk of human rights, there are so many elements and aspects. So one of them, which most companies have and JSW also had, is a code of conduct. Any vendor or supplier of goods and services would need to sign up. Signing up is one thing, but then doing a due diligence, which was mentioned by the previous two presenters, also comes in here. So you do it unannounced, you do it via a third party, and you get the true picture. So that is where it helps to look at going to the supplier side. They may all say that we don't have child labor in our workforce, but then officially, unofficially, so many things actually happen. And this is where the code of conduct also ties in with the SA 8000 thing. That is where the auditors also check. The second would be when you're talking about training and the skills and the job opportunities with people from the MSMEs. That is where the government of India has got a wonderful scheme called the ITIs, those training institutes. And many of the corporates across the country have adopted some ITIs in the vicinity of their operations. And so they not only provide mentoring and training on things, and they also hire and source from them. So this is a benefit gained by all the businesses located at that site of that ITI. So whether it's simple things like carpenters, electricians, electronics, and whatnot, to other related points. So JSW had almost 20 ITIs under its wing. That was the leading number. What I have in my knowledge is, which is about 4 or 5 years old. I do not have the current status, but it still is a very significant number of ITIs. And some of these ITIs are actually rated by the government of India, and they come in the top one or two, in terms of everything. The other area would be there is a linkage which JSW had done with many of these small businesses. First of all, they worked and they tagged it, twinning it with the CSR initiatives, that strategic CSR, where, say, a company like JSW Steel, which has a massive operations at the place in Karnataka in the district of Bellary at a place called Vijayanagar, which is India's largest steel plant, by the way. And that place, it has so many thousands of workers, both permanent and the contract. When they enter the premises, they have to put on that protective clothing. It's like the thick jacket, trousers, safety shoes, helmets, gloves, and all that. So the garments are the kits, as they are called. The workplace kits are provided by a self-help group or more than one self-help groups, uh, which are trained on procuring that kind of special kind of cloth. They were trained to be, stitching and getting certified by some tailoring institutes, and they provide that quality of garments to the workers on a regular basis. So it is actually a win-win-win situation where the company is able to have a steady supply of reliable quality garments. It provides livelihoods to the people in the community, and it also takes care of the workplace related requirements. In the sense, those villagers otherwise typically, and it's a women's self-help group, if you remember, they would otherwise be treated or ill-treated at home, and they would find time to become the trainers and the people who work in shifts in those small places. So even if they are able to work for 3 hours, they get paid for the number of garments they are able to stitch. So it's a very innovative kind of thing that was tried out, and that number has, there are so many now stitching centers, and some of these trained people have even set up their own institutions or their own businesses based on the training that they received, and they are providing other kinds of bags and clothes and garments to the population in the townships in that area and in the villages. In every week there is a weekly market which happens, and they sell over there. So it's a combination of many things, including the human rights aspects in those communities. The other, things would be, in a steel plant, you are aware that there is a huge amount of slag that is produced, which has two kinds of, waste materials, which are mountains. One is the slag, the second is the ash from the burning of the coal. So most of the good quality ash goes into cement making, but then the other ash, which is converted to making bricks, is also looked at by the company has trained the people in the community to take up that as a pastime, not pastime, as a occupation really, and it's a livelihood, means of livelihood. So they would otherwise get into gambling, drinking, wasting time and creating a nuisance, crime. So now they all have jobs. So it's a combination again of more than one thing, including the human rights approach for the people in the community, because most of the workers are from that village in the neighboring areas. So it gives everybody a good quality of life. And there can be many more things I can talk about, but two or three things really stand out. When you're talking about human rights, many of these contract workers, there is a lot of corruption from those agencies which provide the manpower, which means somebody would sign on their behalf and collect their wages, and it would not go to the right person. So that was stopped. How? By two or three things. The company arranged for the Aadhaar card camps to be held in those areas. So it mandated that every person entering has to have the Aadhaar card thing. They has to have a biometric entry and exit thing. So nobody else can sign on their behalf. And exact logging of the time that they spend in the workplace, that gets logged. So if it is under the time, then they get paid accordingly. If it is excess, then that overtime. So all of that gets tied in over there. You're talking about fair labor practices. This is what it is, probably one of the good examples. The other thing is, all the money that is paid is cashless. So it goes, which means banking systems and the financial services was also enabled for these workers, even though they are contract workers. So when these kinds of services are provided, then getting insurance for them, life insurance, health insurance, partly the company would pay, and largely the vendor company has to provide for the people. So these are all, I think, examples of the human rights from a corporate point of view. Um, I think I'll stop here now and wait for further questions to come, and it's an unending discussion, really. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Majumdar. I think that was also extremely insightful. I'm also conscious of the time that we have, and I know that Mr. Sarma has an engagement, so he will leave. In terms of some of the questions that came in, I will probably just go through them one by one quickly, and if you could just within 2 minutes answer the questions. So my first question would be a question that has come in from the audience is this. I would like to believe this is for Mr. Sarma, because he spoke of collaboration and monitoring and being equally important. So one wants to know that how who will sort of cost is a big factor. So who sort of, we are talking about increased monitoring and reporting and policy making, in particular supply chain. So how and SMEs often, like even all our panelists today mentioned that the cost is a factor, but then who bears this cost, and or how is it split, or how does one go about it? So if Mr. Sarma, if you could answer that.
Absolutely. I think it's a very interesting question, and just wanted to put this background. I started my career sometime in 2005, and I mean, especially if you look at, because if you look at a supply chain, it has got different tiers, right? And different tiers are at different levels of evolution. Now, what is happening is there are collaborations at every level. I'm glad Mr. Majumdar talked about certification standards like S8000. I mean, if you look at from my perspective, what I have seen is most certifications, I think they are relevant unless they don't evolve over a period of time, because the reality changes, right? So, for example, if you look at even S8000, I remember when in my previous role from the developmental sector, I had impressed upon the founders of S8000 that no, it's time to also look at, let's say, cotton. But there was this that whole comfortability factor there, that okay, the first year, because I think S8000 was the first ever standard that actually came into the domain, and it was really phenomenal, because what had happened was before that, individual brands and retailers, that was also alluded by Mr. Majumdar and of course Mr. Ghosh, was actually based on code of conduct, and each brand had their code of conduct. So obviously, the focus was on their individual supply chain. So it was incumbent upon the brands to actually put in their money to actually ensure that, okay, fine, this is a supply chain, and I have to ensure the security of the supply chain. So obviously, it's my resources that goes in. However, I think 2 or 3 events that happened, in this whole journey. One was, of course, when the S8000 was realized, because they were, the first event was about multiple brands started sourcing from the same suppliers. So which means, over a period of time, one supplier, one SME would actually face up to about 24 audits in a month, which was duplication, and also it was putting a pressure on the SMEs and the suppliers. So what was agreed was maybe it makes sense to go for a certification. But before that, platforms came in like SEDEX. So at least the UK brands, they came together. We said, okay, fine, let's be members of SEDEX, and let there be one maybe audit that could be accepted by different brands. But unfortunately, and then I'll be very candid here, what happened was, there was Pakistan, when certification, a certified, I have not named it, you can Google search it, collapsed, and there was maybe because of a fire or something. So obviously, like, this whole certification, that level of respect that certification got, actually took a big beating, because the campaigners, the stakeholders, they were really worried that, okay, fine, you get a certificate, and once the certificate is actually broad based, so obviously there are different implementers, and then of course different things come into play. So the next step was that, fine, I mean, maybe we can look at a model where the suppliers, because it's their, like, audit, their facility they're offering, so maybe they pay it. But now I think we have reached a situation where, like, the audit fatigue and of course the cost of compliance, it has gone manifold. So what has happened is now that, and then it's an ever evolving phenomenon. So today we have something called the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, and SEDEX, of course. SEDEX have also, like, really upgraded their thing. S8000, like, they have come up with the management system. So I mean, they are evolving in a way. So today I think maybe the major focus is on continuous improvement model. So you have FSLV, Higgs. So these are the tools which are actually used to look at continuous monitoring. But then the issues remain. That's the unfortunate part. Some of the progressive suppliers, manufacturers have actually moved on. They have their own level of, like, thing. So that's why my thing is that, human rights is something. One, of course, the cost needs to be shared by everybody, and the issue of cost comes in when the focus is only on monitoring. When I talk about collaboration, it has to be a mixture of monitoring and capacity building. And then of course the behavioral change, which is really paramount. And then of course there are other discussions people take from a business viewpoint, which I would not like to dwell into at this point. Thank you.
Right, great, thanks. My next question is for Dr. Majumdar. The sustainable investing landscape is seems to be rapidly evolving around the globe, and you sort of also give a bit of an insight on that. So how does one see disclosures and reporting connected to and driving greater transparency in the supply chains within that context?
I had actually alluded to it very briefly in my
Yes.
earlier remarks. So it's the market which demands that. So companies are forced to make disclosures, and they can make disclosures. Especially if it's a big company, they have a lot at stake. So they've got to get their acts right, and it's got to be assured, it's got to be audited, it's got to be third party certified, not certified. All that is a matter of detail. But then they've got to say the correct things and the true things, because people are smart enough, and in this age of internet, everybody can research and find out what's happening, what's not happening. So that definitely is one thing. So it's two kinds of push points are there on businesses. One is the investors themselves. The second related is the rating agencies, both of them. So there are many of these companies which look at rating businesses. They do benchmarking, they do sector analysis. So all of these are looked at, very closely. As far as the disclosures go, there are several kinds. I mean, there are uh, organizations which look not only at the environmental footprint part, but also on the social footprint part. These interest organizations, one can choose to respond or to ignore. But the moment you ignore, then it starts building up a black image or a negative image against that company. So if you've got something's good in place, you need to talk about it in a very balanced way. It's not greenwashing or rainbow washing or whatever washing it's called. It's a matter of fact. Not everything is hunky-dory. There are challenges, and what are we doing to address them? This is what has also started to come out in the sustainability reports. So if you look at different, I referred to the SDGs in my earlier thing. So when companies are putting the information in the sustainability reports, and looking at that same information through multiple lenses, whether it's the GRI framework, whether it is the SDG framework, or the 10 principles of global compact and whatnot. So all of that really makes a compelling kind of compilation of examples, which has the more transparency and the more disclosure there is, the rating of the companies automatically go up, even if they fear that what they have done, they've not been able to do the best, or they're still quite a way off the many other competitors. But the fact that they're disclosing gets them many brownie points, and that's the best part. And that's what even I had to push through the board in my own company. That doesn't matter, as long as we have a plan and we show the progress the next year, we will be rewarded for that. And that was the case in many of the years that I did.
Great. Great. All right. Yeah, I think there are a few more questions, but like I said, I'm conscious of the time. So maybe these were the key ones. I would now like to invite Mr. Anil Bhardwaj. He is the Secretary General, Federation of Indian Micro and Small and Medium Enterprises, also known as FISME. A very well-known name in the MSME sector. He's led and advised projects with a range of institutions in the past, the World Bank, ADB, Commonwealth, GIZ, and is sort of like an authority figure in this space. So if you could sort of just share with us your thoughts and insights, and then maybe we will end this, today's session.
Thank you, Shreya. What I am supposed to do is to pick up some of the important points that are highlighted by the key speakers, especially Mr. Ranjiv, Mr. Indras Ghosh, and Mr. Suman Majumdar. So let me first begin with Mr. Ranjiv, who tried to see the whole issue from the perspective of sourcing and the risks that are there in the supply chain, due diligence that is required, and how starting from his own company, he has taken or the company has taken steps to ensure that the supply chain is compliant of the expectations, not only in terms of the legal compliances, but also the emerging expectations from the stakeholders. One important aspect that he highlighted is that the approach should not be of preaching when you come to MSMEs and the supply chain, but rather should try to focus on the monitoring and the capacity building, which I think are interrelated. So, I mean, those issues are identified, they are built, the capacity is built, and then monitoring is done. Then he also talked about the fact that, in responding to the question also, that when it comes to the cost, and especially it is true with regards to MSMEs, that the cost need to be perhaps shared in the supply chain, and it should not overburden MSMEs unduly. Mr. Indras Ghosh, on the other hand, tried to see the whole perspective, whole issue from the perspective of the demand side, and how he highlighted, for example, that how the consumer demands in key markets, for example, whether it's in Germany or in France, is leading to development of laws. And then these laws become operative on the buyers and large companies, which ultimately then will have to ensure that their supply chains are compliant to these laws, whether it is in terms of child labor or forced, etc. So we have to also perhaps see that how things are being driven. So increasingly in developed markets, it is the consumer that is becoming more and more conscious of many of these issues, which can be clubbed together as human rights. There are, of course, conflicts that he highlighted, and whether it is in terms of the definition, sometimes the definitions are quite open-ended, like adequate due diligence. Now it can mean anything, and that certainly poses several challenges to MSMEs because they are not sure whether they are complying or whether they are not complying. Then there are questions of overlapping regulations, etc. But his advice is very practical, and what he says is that SME should not suffer uh, in isolation. Rather, ask the buyer, have discussion with your, the stakeholders. Try to see that what are the vulnerabilities vis-a-vis a particular market that you have, and then try to build your capacity and become compliant. Dr. Suman Majumdar, on the other hand, gave his own examples, and particularly from GSW, that how GSW tried to build the capacity, taking things from just the narrow definition of human rights, but also working on economic and social empowerment of the people around. And he also shared about credit rating agencies increasingly becoming more important in ensuring that the expectations of the stakeholders are complied with. So I believe that these are some of the key points that emerged, and I think as who are participating today would have taken note of it and would have benefited. Thank you. It was a pleasure listening to all of them.
Yes, exactly. I think everyone who participated would have taken note of this, and I hope they have. And this is like a practical roadmap to the BHR agenda, adopting the BHR agenda. So yes, thank you so much. Thank you, sir, Mr. Bhardwaj, for joining us. Mr. Ghosh, Dr. Majumdar, and Mr. Sarma for also taking out time from your schedules and being available for this webinar. Of course, FISME, FNF, and IGCC for helping us curate this and presenting it to everyone. We will call it a day, and I hope everyone has a wonderful day. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Shreya, for conducting it very well.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Pleasure listening to all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.